Okay, we're going to look at number 17 out of the book and talk about how to do this problem as a proof. Before we do that, I want to remind you of some strategies. Your teacher may have mentioned these, or your teacher may not have mentioned these, but these are strategies that I've worked with my class. In blue, I said, don't begin a proof by stating two angles are congruent or two angles are supplementary, because there's nowhere to go from there. So for example, in number 17, if I start with angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and I say as my reason given, the question is, then what do I do? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing for you to do there. Anytime you start with congruent or you start with supplementary, you have to start a new train of thought anyway. So I find it more confusing to actually start with that. Because again, I want to start a train of thought, take it from if A, then B, if B, then C, if C, then D, and I can't do that by starting with the congruent. So I actually won't do that. In red, I said when you prove two angles or two segments are congruent, try to use transitive in your next step. I try to do that immediately. I think that if you wait till the end of the problem or later in the problem to try to do transitive, it's confusing. The purple statement is the same thing, but with the congruent supplements theorem. So last class, you talked about congruent supplements and congruent complements theorems, which is similar but different to the transitive property. And so we'll see if that comes up. And then the green point is actually something you need to look for right away. It says look for vertical angles and linear pairs in your diagram. Okay, that can be a first step in a lot of proofs, is actually identifying your vertical angles or your linear pairs. Underneath that, I have identify the pair first. So for example, say angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles. You use your definition of vertical angles as your reason. You could say angle 1 and angle 3 are a linear pair, using your definition as your reason, because your definition tells you what it looks like. And then after you identify it, you state that relationship. So if it's vertical angles, then angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. If it was a linear pair, then angle 1 and angle 3 are supplementary. So let's see if we can use some of those strategies here. So I have given angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Strategy number 1, don't start there. So one of my other strategies is look for vertical angles, look for linear pairs. So I have vertical angles 1 and 2, and I have vertical angles 3 and 4. And in my proof, I actually use all those numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's a possibility that I'm going to use both of those relationships. So I just need to start with one of them. It doesn't matter which. And so I'm going to say that number 1, angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles. Okay, I could also say that the other pair is vertical angles, but I just want to start with one statement and follow it. When you try to list out too many things in the beginning, proofs could get confusing. So angle 1 and 2 are vertical angles. My reason is the definition of vertical angles. How do I know that those two angles are vertical? Okay, my definition says two angles whose sides form opposite rays. In other words, the definition tells you what it looks like. So it wasn't given to you in the given statement that they are vertical. You're using the definition to see it in the diagram. Once I have stated it, then I use my relationship. So I identified it. Now I'm going to use the relationship. I know that 1 and 2 are congruent because vertical angles are congruent. So because of this, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. If you can't remember why, you have your reference sheet you'll be able to use. I go back to vertical angles, and I see vertical angle congruence theorem. If two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. That's my reason. Keep going to the wrong slide there. So, vertical angle congruence theorem. If two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Now, so vertical angles, then congruent. Let's go back to my strategy list. This is a good one to look at my red bullet point. When you prove two angles or two segments are congruent, try to use the transitive property in your next step. So I just proved angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent, and I'm given that angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. Some students like to write that over to the side, say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and then use the transitive property. I like to put it underneath because that's how I like to use the transitive property, but that's completely up to you. Okay, this is a given statement, and because I can match up both of the angles being congruent to the same angle, angle 1, I can say that because of this, as my fourth statement, angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. And that's how the transitive property works. So I've kind of finished out that train of thought. I started with vertical angles. I got congruent angles because of it. I used a given and I used the transitive property. And now I've taken care of the given and I've proved that angle 1, angle 2, and angle 3 are all the same. So I'm trying to prove angle 4. I don't have any more givens to use, so I'm going to look for a vertical angle again. So first I'm going to make some space for myself. And I'm going to start down on a new line because I'm starting a new train of thought. If you just keep going to the right on your paper, it confuses everybody. It's very hard to follow what's going on. A new line of thinking should be a new line on your paper. So you can start wherever you want really. Okay, if you want to start all the way to the left, you can. I'm going to start kind of in the middle and say that I know angle 3 and angle 4 are vertical angles. The reason I'm starting in the middle is because of where it's going to lead to and how my spacing works out. This is my fifth statement. Again, the reason I know that is because the definition of vertical angles, if I know that those are vertical, then I know that they are congruent. So angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. That's still my vertical angle congruence theorem. And now I can use transitive again because I have angle 3 inside each of these separate statements. So angle 2 is going to be congruent to angle 4 using the transitive property, and I'm finished with the proof. I've proved that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent, angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent, and eventually angle 2 and angle 4 are congruent. So please watch this video again, take a picture of the strategies, use those strategies with your proofs, and your proofs will become easier.